We're going to go ahead and get started. So hi, I'm Jamie Doherty. I'm the Lake County Residential Horticulture Agent, and I'm here with Dr. Bill Lester. If you want to introduce yourself too.
Sure. My name is Bill Lester. I'm with University of Florida IFAS Extension in Hernando County, and I'm the horticulture agent here.
Yeah, and we're going to be talking to you about prepping trees for hurricanes. And the title's a little bit of a misnomer. You can't really prepare trees for hurricanes specifically. The goal is to make sure your trees are healthy so they have the best chance when we have extreme weather events. So here's how we're going to go through things today. We're going to start with some terminology. We're going to tell you about what to look for, proper tree pruning, when to call an arborist, and we're going to also tell you about palms because palms are not trees. They're not cared for quite the same. And the goal is to just have a better understanding of identifying tree issues and really knowing when you need to call professionals. So starting off with terminology, and we start with this so as we go through, you understand when we are using those terms. So first off is branch bark attachment. I'll say this one quite a lot during my section of the presentation, and this is the location where you have branch tissue coming together with the trunk tissue. You can also have it where smaller stems come in contact with larger stems, but the main part I'm most concerned with is where branches and trunk attach. So that location is going to be where that red arrow is. So that red arrow is what's called the branch bark collar. And then the next red arrow that just popped up, that's going to be where that branch initially came out. And the part that I'm holding in my hand would have been the trunk at one point. Now, the reason this is really important is because there's tissue within that branch bark collar that allows for healing. So later when we talk about pruning and I say prune to the branch bark collar, the reason for that is because the tree can heal best if we prune it properly at the right angle. And if you notice in this image, you can see that that branch bark collar isn't straight up and down. It does have an angle to it. So our next term is included bark, and included bark indicates a weak branch attachment, and it basically means bark on bark. So it's similar to skin on skin, like if you had your arm where your elbow was bent for long periods, it's going to get sweaty. You can get fungus occurring there. So you don't get sweat in the tree, but you can get moisture and fungal issues accruing there where you could end up getting failures later on. So the red arrow indicates a location of included bark. So another term is drip line, and drip line's easy because after rain, if you walk under the tree, everywhere you get dripped on is the drip line. So it's just where the edge of the canopy is. And really the most critical structural roots are going to be within that area as well. So if you're doing construction or doing any digging, you want to be careful of roots in that area because those roots are what's really helping to hold the tree in place and keep it stable in wind events. So then we have a node. So a node, it's sort of similar to the location of a branch bark attachment, but talking on a smaller scale. So we're talking on branches. So the nodes are the areas where you have growth. So you'll have stems coming out, you can have leaves coming out, and then the internode is the area in between. So if you were trimming here on these, you would be trimming kind of where those arrows are pointing. It's easier to see on the one on the side than on the one on the front. Our next term is target. So a target is what could be hit if a limb or tree was to fall or fail. So if you talk about tree failure, you're talking about something falling down. It's just we use the word failure because something broke, something happened. So in the chat, if you guys could write for me, if this tree was to fail, what do you think a target would be? Oh, and now we've got 4 people. Wonderful. So thank you, everybody, for joining. So just in the chat, if you can find the chat, just write really quick, a target. So if this tree was to fail and any part of it was to fall, what might it hit? Okay, we've got the red car. Okay, we've got the red car, most likely the red car. Now, if there's cars, what else could be around? How do cars move? Unless it's a Tesla. Power car is going to move, guys. That you need a person, right? So that means you potentially could also have people. But it's a parking lot, so it's less frequently going to have people. So one of the things when you're talking about targets is the fact that it is more complicated than just, is it going to fall? Definitely, this is definitely where it's going to fall. This is definitely the consequences. It's way more complicated than that. You have to look at how frequently is the target in the area? How healthy is the tree? Is the tree showing signs of repair from an injury? All kind of things. So a tree, you can have a target, but you might not actually have a hazard. We'll talk about hazards a bit later. And our last term is arborescent, and you see the picture of a palm here. So an arborescent plant means that it's tree-like, but it's not really a tree. So to be a tree, you have to produce true wood in a very specific cellular way. Palms don't do that, so they're arborescent. Other examples of arborescent trees include tree ferns. And let's see what else. We have tree ferns, bananas. There are certain kinds of cycads as well, which are a type of gymnosperm. So something like a sago palm is more closely related to a pine tree than it is to a palm tree. And then you also have things like giant bird of paradise and a few others. So if it gets very tall, it's arborescent and tree-like at that point. So things to look for in a tree that could potentially be hazardous. So you're looking for loose and dead branches, branch bark attachments and included bark. You're looking at trunk lean, trunk damage. You're also looking at species because some of the species have certain characteristics that could innately make them more hazardous. So all of those, again, together could lead to being hazardous. So a hazard means that you have a likelihood of failure and there's a target there. You can't have a hazard if you have no target. So when you're looking for loose, dead branches, so here's some examples of them. Part of it's going to depend on the size. These are relatively small branches. You also have quite a lot of other branches that they're going to hit on the way down. So the likelihood of them causing any significant damage is going to be low, but you do have to look at what the target actually is. And then you have to decide, is the potential risk worth it? And the tree owner has to always decide if the potential risk is actually worth it or not. Now, in Florida, when you have dead limbs, you only have about 6 months before you can expect that they're probably going to start falling on their own because we have decomposition happen so fast in Florida. Whereas dead limbs in, say, Canada, it can take 2 years before they decay to the point where you have to take them down. So the larger the decaying limb, the more important it is that you actually take it out. But again, it depends. Is there something that's going to help block it as it's coming down? That's when you need to, if it's significantly large and it's of a concern, call a professional to come take a look and see if it warrants coming out immediately or you can wait any length of time. And I just realized I forgot to tell you something very important before I keep going. So I am the residential horticulture agent for Lake County. I'm also an ISA certified arborist, and I just finished a track qualification with ISA, which is the tree risk assessment qualification. So I'm giving you some wonderful new information that I've learned about evaluating tree risk and not just automatically cutting it down because it may cause a problem. There's actually great ways to help save those trees. So moving on from there, we're going to talk again about that branch attachment and included bark. So here we have a V-shaped attachment. We don't have included bark yet, but as the sycamore grows, it's likely. So this sycamore is showing something called codominant stems, and that's when you have two leaders and the leader is the part that goes straight up that are about equal size. So ideally, when this tree was younger, one of those would have been cut so you could have one central leader because that's just a stronger structure, especially for sycamores. But V-shapes generally are a bit weaker, but not always. This tree is not going to split in half anytime soon the way it is, but you can have a problem with that with the V-shape and included bark where they can fail and you can get snapping like this. And you don't always know that it's going to happen because the wind can hit it just right and it snaps over, or there's rot happening that you're not aware of. So if you have V-shapes and included bark, it doesn't mean that you're in imminent danger. It just means it's something you need to keep an eye on. So a good idea to have on hand is a rubber mallet and you can have this on hand if you have any trees. If the tree's I'd say probably 18 inches around. You can bang on it with the rubber mallet and just start getting used to what it sounds like. And if it ever sounds hollow, that means that there could be rot occurring. And then you definitely want to call a professional. And normally when you have an arborist come out, they should have a rubber mallet on hand so that they can bang on it and see if there's any kind of hollow sound as well. Now, with included bark and bad branch attachments, the tree can look absolutely healthy. This tree looks great, right? It's an amazing live oak, nice spread. I mean, it looks like it has just one amazingly strong trunk. No signs in the canopy of any kind of issue. And then you take a closer look and you can see that this actually had, when it was younger, a V-shaped attachment that's turned into included bark that's actually splitting now. So this tree is a hazard because it has the potential to split. There's some damage on it as well. So it needs to be checked to see if it's actually decaying. But that doesn't mean you have to take it out. This is a gorgeous tree and the homeowner may love it. You can do things like bracing, cabling, or even rodding to help hold this tree together so the hazard is significantly reduced for this tree. Now, and if we go back one for a second, you can see there's really no target in the area that's of concern. Most cases, the biggest hazard is the driveway might get blocked off. So this was from a neighborhood I lived in for several years, and I was very surprised that it never actually collapsed. I never managed to meet the homeowners. They were never home. All right, so here's another example in a pine. Pine, it's less frequently to have bad branch attachments because they tend to have that one central leader and they just have the 90-degree stems coming off of it. This one's just a little bit of an abnormality, and it's small enough now that in this case, you could just prune that off and then as the tree grows, it would be fine. All right, so we're going to talk a bit about trunk lean. So trunk lean is a couple of things. If it's a new lean, that's showing you the direction the tree is going to fall. And if the tree is freshly leaned, you want somebody to come take a look at it to see if it's truly at risk of falling. Now, if the tree's been leaning for a while, even a significant lean, it may not need to come out. And there's a few things to look for. One is looking at the base of the trunk in that what's called the root flare area. So the area where, the trunk transitions into the roots at ground level. If you go to the opposite side of the lean and you start to see that there's a lot more wood forming on that opposite side, that's called reaction wood. And that's the tree basically growing extra wood to help hold itself up. So that reduces the chances that it's going to actually fall over. Another thing that you can actually see in this picture, which I forgot to put an arrow in for. Let me see if I can draw for you. Okay, I'm drawing the arrow. You should be able to see that. So at that location, you can see that we have a much thicker branch that's kind of starting to go in the opposite direction of the lean to kind of correct itself. So it can either go the opposite direction of the lean or even straight up. And the larger that branch is, the thicker that branch is, the longer it's been leaning and the tree's actively working on kind of correcting its own growth. So those are things that professionals are going to look at to say, hey, the tree's leaning, but it's not really a hazard. It's unlikely to fall down. Here are recommendations for monitoring it. But again, if your tree recently leaned, you definitely need to get it looked at. And if it's actively leaning on something to hold it up, you need to look at that to get it removed because it could be an issue. Because if it's leaning on something and when it's leaning on brakes because of the weight, you're going to have a bit of a problem. So trunk damage is another thing to look for. Now, it's going to be different when you're looking at trunk damage in palms versus trunk damage of true trees. Palms can handle more things than actual trees can. Trunk damage can be quite a bit more significant. So this particular tree would be great if you had land in a forested area and you want to have habitat for animals, but this is not great for an urban setting or a suburban setting. And the reason is, well, in this case, we have sidewalk, which gives us targets of sidewalks and potentially people. And if you look up close, it's completely rotted out with lots of different hollows. So you want to be cognizant of that when you're looking at things. Do you have significant damage? Does that need to come out? Or is it in a place that it's actually providing good environmental services and you don't need to take it out because there's not a problem? Now, when I go hiking, I tend to inspect the trees as I'm hiking along the trail. I do it when I park too. I always inspect the tree before I park under it. And I get a little bit nervous when I see trees that managers let hang over walkways that are rotten because, yeah, it's maybe the trail's not busy. You're not likely to hit a person, but you still could. And, you know, you could maybe not have it hanging over the walkway. So that's one of the things that worries me. But if you see hollows in your tree, it also doesn't necessarily mean your tree's rotted out. You might just have one area that has a hole, a cavity in it that needs watched, and it could be 50 years before that cavity is a problem. It depends on the species and exactly what's happening. So one thing to look out for, if you ever see conchs on any tree or palm, you need to call somebody because that's definitely a sign of some sort of rot and you need to get that looked at. So these are called, it's called conchs when they're on the side of the tree like that. And these are a species of Ganoderma on an oak. Yeah, and if it's on your property, you need to get it looked at right away. And if it's on your palm, you very likely will not be able to plant a palm in that location ever again. But Bill's going to be talking about palms more later. So I mentioned to take into account what species you have as well. So live oaks are a native species, and they're actually adapted to spread out and really get their limbs or their elbows on the table. So those limbs sitting on the ground help to stabilize it in wind events when it's standing out in the middle of nowhere. Now, if you have live oaks growing in a forest, they are going to grow more upright, but the other trees are protecting them. So here we actually have 3 trees that are acting as one with the individual spread, but they're growing in a way that's really helping them to deal with any kind of wind events. Because we do have, even our regular storms in Florida can be pretty windy, let alone getting into hurricanes. So if you have the space to let your tree grow fully, it can adapt quite nicely to hurricanes or wind events. Now, if you were to go in here and take out, say, the tree on the right that's leaning, now you've exposed the other 2 to wind in a way they're not adapted to, which increases the chances that they could potentially fail because they haven't got that reaction wood, because they haven't experienced the wind needed to actually create it. So as trees sway in the wind, it triggers growth to help stabilize them. And if they're not swaying a certain way, they're not going to get that reaction wood. It's kind of like muscle building in you, right? If you don't ever go and do like leg day at the gym, walking upstairs is going to be hard. Or if you don't ever work on your arms, like doing a pull-up is going to be hard. So it's similar to that in a tree. If they don't get that exposure, they're not going to grow what they need to help prevent issues later on. So another species, this is a camphor, and it's actually invasive, and these don't have great strength when it comes to wind events. So there's something as they age to kind of keep an eye on. And as they age, if they start to fail, we'll just really advise taking them out because they have been found to be invasive in our natural areas. Another invasive is the ear tree. Now, if you have these ear pods in your yard, that means you have an ear tree. These are another one that they just don't hold up well to big wind events. They do provide great shade because I know in my neighborhood, there's several huge ones and my neighbors love them because they provide shade. But they are, they're one that naturally could drop more limbs in wind events. One I don't have pictured here as well is really any species of elm. They can just drop limbs just because they don't give you any warning. We have a few in our garden, and we actually just had last week one that just dropped a limb. It had no indication. I was literally looking at the trees the week before, nothing showing that there was any reason to expect a limb to fail, and it just snapped off on the side of it. So pay attention to what trees you have. If you don't know what trees you have, you can always contact your local extension office, and they can help you figure it out. So then you get an idea of what kind of innate hazard the tree might have just based on the species. And I mentioned hazard. So you only have a hazard if you have a target in the area, and the level of hazard really depends on what the target is and what the chances are of having an impact. So you can actually hire a professional to come out and do hazard tree inspections, and there's a really very intricate process of inspecting to determine kind of what the level of hazard is. And then ultimately, as the tree owner, you would have to decide what level is acceptable to you. and then you decide what to do. So anybody doing the inspection should give you several different options on what you could do, and then you get to pick which one you think is right for you and your property. So now that we know all about the terms, we know what we're looking for, now what? Well, we're going to go ahead and talk about how to actually prune properly. So when you're pruning, you want to always do a 3-cut pruning process. And your first cut is always the undercut. And the reason for that is you want to undercut because you want to do that before you take the bulk of the weight of a branch off, because as you take the bulk of the branch off, it might start to tear and rip down on the bottom. And if it does that, it could potentially rip down straight onto the bark, which is hugely damaging to the tree and could result in the need for the whole tree to come down either right away or in a few years. So you do that undercut to protect it. So if you take that second cut at the bulk of the weight, if it rips, it stops at that undercut. It's a similar idea to making fire breaks in forests. It's so the fire doesn't keep spreading. This is so a rip doesn't keep going. So you do your undercut first. You're going to do your second cut to take the bulk of the weight. And you may end up doing more than one second cut, depending on how big the limb is. Okay, so you might have to take smaller bits of the limb off before you get close, really close to the trunk. But once you're close to the trunk, you're about 12 inches away, you do that undercut, you do that second cut for the topmost, and then your final cut, you cut at the branch bark collar, leave the branch bark collar intact, remember, so that it can heal properly. And let me show you what that looks like on an actual tree. So here we have an arrow showing, yes, this is where your final cut would be, and you can see it's at an angle near where this particular tree has a little bit of swelling to show you where the branch bark collar is. Not all trees do that, but take a look. Some of them have really great indications of where that collar is. Now we have no is where it would be more of a flush cut, which isn't great because then you're going to cut through the branch bark collar and it's going to take a lot longer for that tree to heal, and you have a lot more potential for pests and diseases to come in and attack the tree and get through the tree's defenses into the main part of the trunk. So I'm going to go through a few no's on pruning next. A big one is lion tailing. And for whatever reason, a lot of companies consider this hurricane pruning. So what they do is they take all of the branch structure off to the tips, kind of like a lion tail. But this actually makes the tree more susceptible to breakage, even in regular storm events, let alone hurricanes. Because what you've done is you've moved the center of gravity to the end of the branches, which when they move puts more stress on the branch attachments in the middle, increasing the chances of it breaking. And in physics, it's about the lever arm if you want to get into that. But don't do this. You don't want to do that. Instead, if the tree is getting too big and you're concerned about it, you want to do reduction pruning, which means pruning from the ends and bringing them in a little bit to make the tree a little bit more compact, so that you don't have as much movement in the canopy when you have the storms going through. You can do some clearing of dead branches, water spouts, and other things in the middle, but you shouldn't have it nearly as open as this is. The wind doesn't just blow through and go by with no harm. It's going to, again, shake those branches to the point of breakage in many cases. Now, when I say reduction pruning, I don't mean this. This is called topping, and topping is indiscriminate pruning back to a specific point. It creates weak branch attachments. It creates a higher chance of failure later on as those grow back. And it's just not healthy for the trees at all. Trees need the leaves to photosynthesize, and this is not a professionally approved method of pruning in this country and most of the rest of the world. I say most because there are certain European countries that keep doing it, and ISA is working on them. That's all I can say. Don't top your trees. And that goes for crepe myrtles as well. They can grow really nice and large. You don't have to top them the way that they tend to like to do around here. So no flush cuts. I mentioned flush cuts before, and the fact that it can have more pests and diseases enter. Now you can see here, this is a pretty big branch that got cut off. And if we look at it on the other angle, we actually have included bark on top of it. And now we have this huge wound that's over a third of the size of the main trunk. And unless the branch has something wrong with it, you really shouldn't take things off that are that big because it could lead to problems for the tree later on. And this was in a neighborhood I used to live in, and there was nothing wrong with the branch that I saw. And even the cuts, it's a flush cut, so it's not a good cut either. So let's talk a bit about safety. So homeowner pruning safety and PPE. So don't worry, you don't have to look exactly like this if you're pruning at home, but if you hire somebody, they should look pretty close to this. So a few things you want to remember. Number one is that chainsaws can kill people if they're not maintained properly. So make sure your chainsaw is maintained, your chain is nice and sharp. And I really recommend chaps, especially you've got the chain lower than your waist. If that chain breaks and snaps back on a leg, it can break an artery. So I really want you guys to be safe. You never want to have the chainsaw above your head. And you do want to have eye protection and hearing protection. Hard hat's always good because you don't know if something's going to fall on your head while you're actually trimming. So homeowners should really work from the ground. If you're climbing up in a ladder, it increases the chance of you getting injured. It also increases the chance of you not holding the chainsaw properly and actually doing harm to the tree while you're trying to do the pruning. And you never want to prune anywhere near power lines because you don't want to accidentally electrocute yourself or someone else. So if this overwhelms you, that's okay. Just call a professional. In many cases, you can call an ISA arborist to come out and take a look at your trees and get a quote for no cost. You just have to call and ask, hey, do you charge for a consultation? They may or may not, and just keep calling until you find somebody you want to work with. So how do you call? So you want to get a certified arborist, and the reason for that is they're trained in tree biology and safety. They're going to think long-term about the tree, not short-term about how much money they're going to make on it. And they've signed a code of ethics. So if they don't do something correctly, you actually have recourse. You can actually report them to ISA. They could potentially lose their certification for a while. They have to do certain things to be able to get it back. And things that you want to check for when you're hiring somebody is you really want an ISA certified arborist on that crew somewhere. Tree risk assessment qualification is a plus, but it's not a requirement. You might not need that. If you're getting standard pruning, your tree's not particularly large, you might not need that. I do suggest getting a tree risk assessment every few years when you have a much larger tree, just to make sure that everything's safe, because they may need to climb and really get a good look at the tree. No matter who you hire, they should have insurance. They should be familiar with the basic ANSI standards of Z133.1 and A300, and those are the basic safety standards. So that means that they know how to protect themselves, how to protect you, and how to protect your property. Get a written quote for the work with specific details of what they're going to do, because then you know what to expect, and if there's any changes, they need to talk to you about it before they do the work. And if anyone mentions topping, you really shouldn't hire them. That doesn't mean that they know what that really indicates they don't know what they're doing or they're not following a code of ethics. So you want to make sure that you've got somebody that knows what they're doing and that has your best interests at heart. So to contact them, you can contact your local extension office to get the information as well. You can also go to treesaregood.org, and you can actually contact an arborist there. They have a Find an Arborist site. You can also go to the ISA website. You have Florida ISA, National ISA. You can find arborists on both of those sites. Again, Cooperative Extension, and the Tree Care Industry website also has information to give you more help there. So I'm going to ask real quick if you guys have any tree questions before I get to Bill with palms, and we will have time for questions at the end as well. Any burning desires before we trade off? Seeing none, I'm going to go ahead and move on to Bill, and then we'll get to any questions at the end.
Okay, great. If anybody does have any questions, just go ahead and put them in the chat box, and I'll probably go ahead and save most of them until the very end, and then we'll go through and cover all of them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about palm trees, and like Jamie mentioned very briefly, palm trees are different. So the way that you care for a palm tree is very, very different than how you care for, let's say, an oak tree or a pine tree. Even calling palms palm trees is a little deceptive because technically, in many ways, they're not trees. They don't produce any real wood. They do have, pulp. They do have substance inside of them, but technically it's not wood. And because they grow differently, you're going to care for them differently. You're going to manage them differently. And then as you're preparing them for hurricane season and storms, you're going to do different things to them. With palm trees, I can tell you from personal experience and answering a lot of questions from homeowners and putting together a huge collection of pictures of things that you should not do and ways you should not manage palm trees. If you do just a few different things to manage your palm trees correctly, and you have a nice healthy palm tree outside, when a hurricane or tropical storm comes, you really don't have to worry about it. The palm tree will generally take care of itself if you care for it and manage it year round, year after year properly. Now, one way the palm trees are very different from hardwood trees is they only have a single growing point, a meristem. So if you think about it, if you look at a palm tree, you don't see branches growing out the sides. They don't have branches or included bark or anything like that that you could find on an oak tree or magnolia or a pine tree. They only have one single growing point. It's at the very top tip of the trunk, and that is the most important point in the entire tree. If that point where the brand new leaves emerge becomes damaged or killed through, let's say, a freeze or frost, insect damage, hurricane damage, physical damage, whatever, the tree will not survive. The tree is going to have to be taken down. They cannot resprout new branches and grow sideways because they only grow upwards. And to make things even worse about palm trees, there is a lot of bad information and poor care out there. For anybody who's new to the state and maybe new to actually having palm trees in your yard and having to take care of them, if you look around your neighborhood and you even look at what some of the professionals are doing, please don't assume that they're doing things correctly, because I see a lot of mistakes being made every day right in my own neighborhood. All I have to do is hop in my car and drive down the street here in Brooksville, Florida. You don't have to go too far to find poorly managed palm trees. So next slide. So number one, if you have a palm tree and it is severely diseased, damaged, dying, or dead, you need to go ahead and remove that as soon as possible, because diseased or dead palm trees will never get better or recover. And what's going to happen is the leaves are going to continue to fall off, and eventually the trunk starts coming down. Even without a hurricane, even in afternoon thunderstorms, maybe even on a quiet night when it's time for it to come down, it will come down. So for anybody who has palm trees on your property, there are several different palm tree diseases that we deal with here in Florida. One of the newer ones is the common name for it is called lethal bronzing. And this is a picture here taken from the Hernando County Courthouse in downtown Brooksville. They have palm trees on their property that have lethal bronzing. And what this does is it starts to kill the leaves starting at the very bottom, moving upwards very quickly, and eventually will kill the spear leaf or the growing point on the tree. At that point, the tree is a goner and has to be removed. It's never going to get better. So if you have a dead or severely damaged palm tree that needs to come down, you probably want to make that call and get it done now, because if you wait until after a storm hits, very, very difficult to get in touch with an arborist or a tree service at that point. They're all pretty busy after a hurricane comes through. So next slide. So another way the palm trees are very different from hardwood trees, and this confuses people a little bit, is how they're made up inside. So if you look at a pine tree or an oak tree and you take a cross section of it and you look at how that tree moves water and nutrients up and down through the tree, it all happens just underneath the bark. There's a ring around the entire tree of tissue that moves water up and nutrients up and down from the roots all the way up to the leaves and the branches. So pine trees and oak trees cannot suffer a lot of damage to their trunk. If somebody calls here and says, I have an oak tree and the bark is falling off, that is really, really bad. That usually, not always, but usually indicates some kind of terminal problem with that tree. If they say, I have a palm tree and some of the bark is falling off, and palm trees technically don't even have bark, it's called pseudo bark, but it's kind of the same thing. It's the covering on the outside of the trunk. If it looks bad, starts chipping off, flaking off, little bits coming off. For a palm tree, it's really not that bad. They can survive that and live through that for many years. This is a picture of Sylvester palmist in my front yard. And when we bought the house, it has a big chunk taken out of the trunk down near ground level. Now, this makes for a slightly hazardous tree because this is a weak point in the trunk. So if we have really, really high winds and that tree bends, there's a good chance that it may snap there because it's thinner. So it does make it a little bit dangerous. It's in the middle of my front yard. If it falls, it will not hit or damage anything. I'll have to deal with it, but other than that, it's really not a hazard. But palm trees can take a surprisingly large amount of damage to their trunks without it being a huge problem. So if you go to the next slide, I have a few more pictures there that have been sent to me. The palm tree, so starting with the far left, this is a palm tree where some of the pseudo bark has fallen off and it's actually trying to send out roots. Palm trees get root initials up the trunk, so not above ground level, they will try to put out roots, and that's not a problem. Doesn't indicate a disease or anything wrong with the palm. It's just an unusual palm tree thing. So the palm tree on the left is fine. The picture on the right is a Washingtonia palm in my backyard, and some of the pseudo bark is chipping off of it. Not a big problem, but that tree in the center there, I believe, was an oak tree, and that has a lot of bark falling off. That indicates a serious problem that I really couldn't diagnose fully just from a picture. For something like that, I recommend the person contacts an arborist to come out and look at it in person to find out why that bark is falling off. If too much falls off or it falls off too deeply, that is going to indicate a pretty serious problem for an oak. So next picture. And like I said, I don't have to drive but maybe 5 minutes down the street to find palm trees that are being managed like this. And unfortunately, this is done a lot in subdivisions, HOAs, in front of business parks, even in front of county buildings. There's this old wives' tale about hurricane pruning. And research has found that is a very, very bad idea. I think the logic behind it is if a hurricane comes, it's going to blow the leaves off of palm trees. So we have to cut almost all the leaves off. That way, nothing is going to blow off the tree and hit somebody or hit a car or break a window or cause damage like that. What they found is taking off too many leaves of a palm tree is a very, very bad idea. So with just normal day in, day out palm tree maintenance, if you have a palm tree in your yard, only take the leaf off if it is totally dead. Even palm tree leaves that are half brown and half green are still moving all the nutrients from that leaf up to the new growing point. And it's very, very important to keep those nutrients within the palm tree. If you start cutting off only half brown leaves or totally green leaves, you're robbing the tree of nutrients. They're going to have to be replaced through fertilizer, and it takes time for a palm tree to take fertilizer up, move it through the trunk, assimilate it up into the leaves. If you take too many leaves off a palm trees will give off a chemical cue that attracts palmetto weevils, which is a great big beetle. It's the largest weevil in the North America, and they will find your palm tree and they will drill into it, and their grubs will chew away at the growing tip of your palm tree and kill it. After palmetto weevils have damaged a palm tree, there's nothing you can do to remediate that damage. And even if you have weevils in your tree, there's really nothing you can spray that's going to be effective. So the best thing to do is don't over prune. Palm trees will give off that scent also if they're hit by lightning. So out in the forest, if a palm tree is hit by lightning, it gives off that scent. The beetles will come swarming, and within a day or so, your tree will be filled with beetles munching away, helping to decompose it to go back into the forest. That's how things happen in nature. But for homeowners, you do not want to over prune a palm tree. Very, very bad for storms and very, very bad for long-term palm tree health. So next picture. Also, when Jamie mentioned being careful when pruning trees, using personal protection equipment. That is very, very important. This picture was shared with me. I guess I could say what area it was. This came from the villages. And these are professionals out there pruning palm trees. This is very, very dangerous. You don't want to be on a forklift, standing on a pallet, out in the open. Make sure that if you hire a service to work on your palm trees, you hire somebody legitimate. There are a lot of people who drive around in a pickup truck with a chainsaw and a pole saw, and you have to ask them, do you have insurance? Because if they get hurt on your property and they don't have workman's comp and insurance, you are liable for their medical expenses. If they do any damage to your house or yard or sprinkler system or roof or whatever it might be, if they're not insured, you're going to be paying the bill. Make sure they know what they're doing. This is extremely dangerous. To see professionals doing this is a little frightening, number one, a little disturbing, number two. And one thing Jamie mentioned about the different types of personal protection equipment you may want to wear. For palm trees, there are many palms that if you're trimming off leaves, hopefully completely dead leaves, at the base of the leaf, they have very, very large spikes or spines. Washingtonia palms have brutal, huge, sharp spikes on them. Sylvester palms have shorter spikes, but they're very, very sharp also. Cabbage palms don't have spikes, so they're not going to stab you. You don't have to worry. And other ones don't. But you have to see what kind of palm tree you have. If it has spikes, you probably want to wear a hard hat, because if you're up there with the pole saw pruning off a leaf and it falls and it hits you in the head or anywhere else in your body and pokes you, many times people will get really, really nasty infections from that, because the palm tree and the leaves and the spikes are out in the environment. They pick up bacteria, they pick up all kinds of nasty things on them. You need to be safe and be very, very careful you don't get poked with those spines. If you do, make sure that you clean it off and disinfect it well. But believe it or not, you really should, if you're going to be trimming palm leaves above your head, go out and invest in a hard hat. Otherwise, if a branch comes down and pokes you in the head, you're going to wish that you had gone out and bought a hard hat. So next picture. So when people start thinking, well, we have a hurricane or a tropical storm coming, how is my palm tree going to behave in high winds? Palm trees have been here for a lot longer than we have been. Cabbage palms are native to Florida and a good part of the southeast US. They range all the way up into the Carolinas. And if they could not handle hurricanes, they would have gone extinct many, many, hundreds of years ago. So it's pretty interesting, and research has found that palm trees in really, really high winds, remember I mentioned that the most important part of a palm tree is the meristem, or that one growing point. What happens in high winds is the leaves will fold up on top of that growing point and actually protect it. I know that here in Extension, we used to have an agent who had worked at the Breakers down in South Florida. I think it's in West Palm Beach. It's a resort. And he was in charge of all the property. And they used to hurricane cut their palm trees on the property. And he told them, that's a really bad idea. So they tried something. They tried hurricane pruning half. The other half, they did not hurricane prune. And I can't remember what hurricane it was, but a really bad hurricane hit that part of Florida. The hurricane prune trees almost 100% died because they did not have enough leaves to fold up in the winds and cover that growing tip. The other ones that have been pruned lighter and they left more leaves on, folded up, protected the tip, and 99% of them survived the storm. So hurricane pruning, not only is it bad for the healthier palm, it doesn't help protect it or protect you or the neighborhood in the event of a hurricane or a bad storm. So no hurricane pruning. If you go to hire a service and they suggest it, hire somebody else. It's as simple as that. Services should all know this nowadays. It's not a secret. It's nothing new. As a matter of fact, in certain counties in South Florida, I think Palm Beach County, Broward, and maybe Miami, it is illegal to hurricane prune palms because it shortens the lives of palms and then makes them even more dangerous in case you get a storm. So next slide. So if you manage your palms correctly and prune correctly and fertilize correctly and take all the other steps that you're supposed to take, and if you need more information on palms, just contact either myself or Jamie Lynn, or if you look online under University of Florida Palm Tree Care, you will find just a wealth of resources there on how to properly care for them and have healthy palm trees. If you do that, when the big storm comes and we're all sitting at home watching the TV and all the emergency operations centers are open and we're watching the forecast track, you could be like Cashmere the Husky here and just sleep through the entire thing and not worry about your palm trees or your oak trees or pine trees, because you know they're already taken care of and there's nothing to worry about. So